I am Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the acting director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. On behalf of the center, as well as Casa San Jose and the organizing committee for the Hispanic Heritage Month, we want to welcome you to this event, which we hope that you find as important, as touching, and as thought-provoking as we think it will be. It is Reality Made Invisible, the plight of undocumented immigrants in the United States. It will be moderated by Dr. Patricia Documet, whom I'll be handing the microphone over to.
Buenas tardes. My name is Patricia Documet. I am Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Public Health, and I have the honor of presenting 3 panelists today for this event. We are going to hear first from Ligia Diaz, who holds a master's degree in education from the University of Pittsburgh. And as a former lead at the Immigrant Family Reunification Program in Fairfax County, Virginia, she has a great deal of experience in the challenges immigrants face as a family and with their children's school, and also with the strengths of these families to confront their difficult situations. The second person we are going to hear from is Dr. Susan Terrio. Dr. Terrio is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at Georgetown University. Her vast scholarship includes works with juvenile justice systems and unaccompanied undocumented children in the United States. She's an accomplished author. For example, among other books, she wrote Whose Child Am I? Undocumented Unaccompanied Children in the U.S. Immigration Custody. That was selected as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title in 2016. In 2019, she published Illegal Encounters, Migration, Detention, and Deportation in the Lives of Young People. It centers on the treatment of undocumented child immigrants who have come to the United States since 2014. And finally, we are going to hear from Anna Clark, who holds a Master in Social Work degree, and she is Service Coordinator at Casa San Jose. She works with the ISAC program, which stands for Immigrant Services and Connections. As such, she has extensive and current experiences with clients who face issues of immigration, reunification, education, and more as they adjust to life in Pittsburgh and the United States. And thank you very much. I will leave you with Ligia Diaz.
Thank you. How are you, everybody? Thank you for joining us. And thank you for the wonderful introductions, Patricia. All right, so I'm gonna focus on the background and how they come here, why they come here. I want to start by saying that migration to the United States from Central America and Mexico is not new, as we all know. Around 265,000 have left the Northern Triangle region of Central America, which is comprised of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras since 2014, with the majority coming, with their destination being United States. The poverty rates, I don't have to read them to you. You can see how high they are in each country, as well as how young the population is in each of the 3 countries, which is, they are called the Northern Triangle. In terms of the reasons for them leaving their countries of origin, in 2018, the International Organization for Migration conducted a rapid survey among the migrants in the caravan coming to the US and found that 52% cited fleeing poverty, 18% cited fleeing violence and insecurity as their main motive for leaving, and 2% family reunification, and 28% cited a combination of all these factors are their main driver for coming to United States. And of course, research has found that climate change and poor governance has been a major driver for migrants to come here. There is a lack of political will, low investment in education and health, rampant corruption. Among some of the lowest tax collection rates in Latin America are in these three countries, including my own home country, Nicaragua, as well. And state institutions are underfunded. So without that strong state presence in neighborhoods and cities feeling left alone, they have become very vulnerable to criminal trafficking of people, drugs, and arms. So that's kind of the socio-political economic background. I did share a link to a video. It's only 5 minutes, but I don't have time now to show it to you. The organizers will send it to everybody at the end. You can watch how some people give testimony of what they go through in order to come here. So in terms of values, I want to talk about values because these are the strength. These are the things that give these families that resiliency to overcome all the hardship. You may think, oh my goodness, how these families can live their lives behind to go that horrible journey in the desert and be almost sentenced to death by taking that journey, and then still come here, be getting that kind of treatment that they're being subjected to in immigration. And then if they make it, to meet their relatives, then the struggle to try to find a job here and work in some of the lowest paying jobs in the United States. But they do it. They do it, and they have a lot of strength and a lot of dreams, and their dreams make them do this. They don't see any other way of doing it back in their countries with the conditions that I just described very briefly. I could go on for hours talking about Central America since I am from there and I used to live and work there. But of course, there is no time, so we have to summarize here. So in terms of values, while Hispanic culture is complex and there is no single way to pinpoint specific factors that summarize parenting values, the factors identified here have been found relevant components of Hispanic parenting values in different research studies. So from an early age, respect holds an influential role in Hispanic households. In traditional Hispanic culture, respect involves obedience and deference. Respect indicates a certain level of courtesy that we owe towards others, varying on the individual's age and situation. For example, when referring to elders or people of authority, such as teachers, school staff, children and youth are taught to use the usted form instead of the tú form, because the tú seems too informal and disrespectful. They are also taught to look down. They're not taught to look in the eyes. So we have to take into considerations all these cultural differences when they are adapting to school and life here in the United States. Respect transcends through times and generation, and the value of respect plays a really important role in parenting practices. Being disrespectful is almost like considered like a sin among Hispanic families. And you have a quote there from a parent. Another important value is familismo. And familismo is a terminology that researchers here in the United States have given to this way of us feeling connected to each other and putting our needs behind so that we would connect with the community. And we see family well beyond our nuclear family. So we pay attention to what grandparents, uncles, and aunts and godmothers have to say about how we should live our lives, because we feel that all of them love us and want the best for us. So we do pay attention to what others say. So for us, it's not so much metiche. We say metiche in our countries. You're not being metiche if you give me an advice. I will pay attention, I will listen, because maybe you are seeing something that I'm not seeing. And that's how we grow up. So familismo, of course, has good consequences. Individuals commonly interact with large social networks, frequent one another regularly, and are available for each other if support is needed. And that also helps their resiliency. But on the other hand, it can cause psychological distress arising from family conflict or the strain of meeting different family expectations related to family cohesion. The distress can result in poor psychological outcomes for Latino youth, and this was found in Diaz and Plight in 2008. So, of course, it's not all gold, right? Then in terms of religion, Hispanic place that great importance on religious matters. Religion is seen as a community involvement where individuals can join spiritual forces, work through their struggles as a family, and form social networks. Within this culture, it is more common to see a large interconnectedness between one's family and the church community. Spirituality is passed on from generation to generation. Several traditions dearest to their hearts are maintained and bring them together and build up their resiliency. Now, once they are here, they need to form that new home. And what is that new home? How does it look like? There is always parents' perspective. The parent, for example, expect their children to be grateful for the sacrifice they have made by migrating to the States and providing for their children back home, while also maintaining usually a new home here. Instead, the children may feel ambivalent about leaving their surrogate caregivers and reuniting with their parents. Parents often report difficulties guiding and having their kids listen to them. It is not easy to regain their kids' trust. Parents may feel guilty and may result in inconsistencies and overindulgence, especially in the first few months of the child's arrival. Young children may be clingy, fearful of new situations, and difficult to console. Youth may be resentful. There may be jealousy towards the siblings that were born here and have not separated from their parents. And also resentment because the older children that usually migrate later that come here and reunite with their parents have to do house chores and now have to help with the younger siblings that were born here. So there is a lot of new things to adapt while they are also learning to navigate a new school system with new language and new culture. And also, we have to consider that youth may have been living very independently back in their homes. Due to necessity, they might have started to work very early in their lives, in the field, in the market, growing crops, making money for the family. And also schools back there won't have the system to control whether the kids are coming or not and enforce attendance. So these kids may have been living almost like an adult back home, and to come here and to have to adapt to structure within society, within the family, within the school system, with all the rules the schools have here, it's really hard on them. Also, we have to consider that very few Hispanic families will seek counseling during these difficult times due to the stigma that can be associated with it, with the fact of seeking counseling or mental health services. So we kind of started talking about these. Let's say that the one thing I want to add here is the trauma, the trauma that these kids may have lived before, prior to their journey, during the journey, and once they are here in adapting to the new setting. They may have witnessed violence at home, back home. They may have, of course, witnessed violence and distress during their journey. And this may come in the forms of nightmares and fears during, well, once they are here trying to adapt. We had kids in her class when I was working that would react to the fire alarm, and they would not like it. It was too many lights in the classrooms, and the fact of being enclosed the entire time, not having recess. Recess is never removed from the school structure in Central America. We have recess all the way through high school. and the kids can go outside. So here is totally the opposite. It's a strong change for them. And like I was saying, the schools in Central America have less of a budget and thus less methods to enforce regular attendance and to provide also communication with the parents. There is not such thing as all these different methods of communication that the teachers have here with the parents. You know, the schools might look like the one you have there at Rose School in Honduras. And so for the parents to be on top of all the communication that could happen, it's a lot. So what trauma could look like, and this is gonna be a snapshot of what trauma could look like. Some symptoms can be jumpiness, intrusive thoughts, interrupted sleep and nightmares, anger and moodiness, emotional detachment and isolation. It could be fear and anxiety, somatic complaints like lack of appetite, regressive behavior like thumb sucking, for babies or small kids, impulsivity and aggressive behavior and substance abuse. Now, also kids may not be so good at forming new attachments because their parents have left them before. And secondly, they had to leave their surrogate caregivers back home. So they have had to separate so many times from loved ones that it could be very hard for these kids, these immigrant youth, to form new attachments once they're here. And they might lose control when corrected or slightly reprimanded. They might fight when criticized or teased by others. They might resist transitions or change and feel overwhelmed by feelings of frustration and anxiety because they don't feel successful once they're here. Now, many kids used to tell us, I thought I was going to see these huge buildings like in New York, and I was going to be surrounded by, you know, a lot of wealth and excessive access to everything. And once I came here, I realized my mom lives in a tiny little apartment with all these siblings and sometimes with other relatives, and we all struggle, and I have to go to school all these hours, and I cannot work and make money like I wanted to. So many youth feel frustrated when they come here, despite you know, the efforts that their parents made to bring them here and reunite. So a little bit of what happens with these families once they are here. So now Hispanic families are one of the largest minorities in the United States, but they are the ones that do not have the same kind of access to healthcare as non-white Hispanics. While more than 90% of the Hispanic children in the US are US citizens, Hispanic children that proportionally live in poverty, suffer from health problems such as overweight and obesity, and enter school inadequately prepared. In terms of contribution to the economy, immigrants without a 4-year college degree made up 46% of all workers in the following industries: farming, fishing, forestry, as well as building, grounds cleaning, and maintenance. So they all contribute and they all pay taxes because they cannot work without a tax number, even if they don't have a Social Security. So they might not be accruing to their Social Security for retirement, but they are paying taxes and they are paying rent and, of course, for food and everything else. I want to emphasize mental health because that's what we saw that is needed. They do need more access to support. The rates of depressive symptoms have been reported between 20 and 38% in the United States in samples of Hispanic Latino women in Florida, California, and Massachusetts. And these are research from 2014, the latest I could find. Maybe later Patricia can comment more on this since this is more public health area. There is lack of access to mental health services, like we mentioned before. Some families even say that they have felt betrayed, you know, by their providers. They have felt judged or betrayed. In terms of acculturation phases, we have summarized their phases into two, basically. There could be more. but recently arrived and the ones that have started a process of acculturation. And the recently arrived parents are meeting basic needs. They're learning a new language and struggling to find a new job. They might take as priority the need to provide for the family instead of dedicating time to their children. Once they have a job and at least a way to maintain their family, they start that process of acculturation in which they start integrating new values, becoming more involved in their children's academics. And some parents do become very successful in that, and they do seek help. And if help and interpretation is provided, they do attend school programs and events, and they get involved, and their kids start succeeding. Parents know the value of speaking two languages, but in many instances, as their children grow, they stop enforcing speaking Spanish at home because their kids don't want to, and they don't feel they have enough, strength to enforce it at home. And their kids now can speak very good English, and they do all the schooling in English, and their friends speak English, and so they don't feel like they want to struggle with the Spanish. So unfortunately, in many cases, these kids are not fully bilingual. Like, not in all cases they are fully bilingual. There is a phrase here from a mother: "I have noticed myself letting my child speak in English, even though I would prefer for him to speak in Spanish more often than not." This is from a study in 2018. And it is hard for parents to also adapt to the culture in the United States, like sleepovers and Halloween and spending time with friends that they don't know. And sometimes also they don't have a choice because they work 2 or 3 jobs out of the house. And so these kids start making friends in the neighborhood, and nobody's really watching whether these friends are good influence or bad influence. And unfortunately, if there are not good mentors in school and not good guidance in school, these kids may start getting in trouble. And that's when, we have more issues, because the kids are just hanging out with whoever they see, and they might actually look for those faces that look similar to what they used to see back home, and those behaviors that they used to see in their neighborhoods back home. And so it might be not exactly the best behavior, but that's what they see as familiar. So in an environment where everything is unfamiliar, you look for the more familiar things, and that's what you follow. And so some school psychologists and counselors, wanted to understand what's going on. But the thing is that if there are no other more role models for them at home or in school that really connect with them in a certain way, they will follow that other role model that they're used to see around them, and sometimes it's not the best. Now, parents do report that at certain point they start learning about important things in the United States, like discipline, and how they should start disciplining their children. And some parents in this research that I was checking, which, some of these things is from my conversation and my work in the schools, but also from things that have been published. And some of these parents are saying, yes, due to fear through authorities involvement like the police and CYF, I have increased my awareness of the benefits of verbal means through observation and discussion with other parents and professionals instead of physical punishment. And lastly, this is my last one, is about what can be done. And we need more supportive atmosphere in the classrooms, the health clinics, and other public offices. We need to fill them with empathy and hope, demonstrate that genuine interest in the family current situation and well-being, promote connectedness and a sense of responsibility and belonging. All stories are important, and encourage them to tell their stories, for example, through art, writing, and drama. In one of the schools that I used to work, they had a week on poetry, and also the counselors were flexible, and they were letting the students that were learning the English to express themselves in either English or Spanish, or partly in English and partly in Spanish. So they would feel free to share what they had inside them through either poetry or drawing or art. being careful about assumptions, using active listening skills and avoiding making judgment of the stories that they are sharing. Providing access to extracurricular activities for English learners, which is hard because, like I said, the parents are not the typical parents that will be available at 3 o'clock to pick them up at the school, or will be home making cookies for their kids in the afternoon. No, these parents will be working until 8 o'clock at night in many cases, or sometimes we'll have a second shift that starts at 6 in the afternoon until midnight, cleaning hotels and gyms and places like that. Promoting parent engagement, providing information, bilingual information, parenting programs, strengthening parenting skills and communication in the family unit, placing more bilingual staff in schools and health clinics. In many cases, we saw that there were counselors or other professionals in the schools that were bilingual, but in the health area, there was no one. And so we needed to go and walk with the kids when they had an emergency or a situation to the clinic because the nurse had no idea how to help them. Help the child predict what will happen while transitioning to a new home and a new school. It's amazing how specific you have to be with these kids. You know, here is expected that you go to your locker. Here is expected that you get your things and you move to from classroom to classroom, and you can raise your hand and speak out and tell your opinion. We want to hear your opinion. In Central America, giving your opinion in public schools is not something that is very promoted. We're actually taught to memorize. Unless you go to a private expensive school, then you're taught other skills like critical thinking. But in public education, they get very little of that. They don't want them to think. So, you know, telling them explicitly what you want them to do, how you want them to learn, how you want them to even behave. There were teachers that were complaining because the Central American kids touch each other too much because we do the handshake or the hug or whatever, and we're okay with touching each other by saying hi, and some teachers didn't understand, why do you need to touch each other so much? So explaining here in schools, we actually don't encourage this because of this and that. And if you explain the reasonings behind it, then they'll get it through time, but with patience and good manners. And again, just putting that behavior in context and providing age-appropriate opportunities to have fun and be a kid. And not forgetting that families are living in fear, especially since 2016, and have limited transportation, and many are juggling multiple jobs. That's all.
Thank you, Ligia. And now I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Susan Terrio.
All right, thank you. And Ligia, thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive introduction to the opportunities and challenges. I'm going to switch focus a little bit and talk about, because I'm very interested in the legal policies that affected largely immigrant families who are undocumented and coming to this country because they fled their homes in Central America and Mexico and sought refuge. Obviously opportunity as well. They fled poverty, but I want to concentrate on largely the women who sought protection in this country through asylum. And I want to take us back and provide some context and background by considering the year 2014. Many of you know that there were record numbers of Central American and Mexican women and children who fled their homes and came to the US. Murders by criminal groups soared, and the violence against women, both at home and in the street, exploded, and the rule of law was rapidly disintegrating. And at our southern border, Customs and Border Protection apprehended 19,000 families in that year, largely single mothers with children from the countries in the Northern Triangle. 2 years later, those apprehensions increased by 78%. And what was interesting, under the Obama administration, they were quickly overwhelmed by what was an urgent humanitarian crisis at our southern border. But because they were overwhelmed, they reframed that crisis and those record numbers as a national security threat and began to implement enhanced deterrence and enforcement policies. First of all, the White House under Obama instituted a policy of detaining mothers with children who were seeking asylum in private immigration prisons. They were confined initially in a very hastily constructed facility in Artesia, New Mexico, that opened in June of 2014. And the deportation of asylum seekers from that facility started just 17 days later. It was a deportation mill, and it was closed just a few months later in mid-December because of repeated allegations of due process violations, unsafe conditions, the maltreatment of children and parents, woefully inadequate medical care, and deliberate misinformation about the possibility of release. This will be a leitmotif as I explain the way these detention and deportation policies have evolved. But that same month, in December of 2014, after closing one facility, the Obama administration opened a brand new, what they call Family Reception Center with 2,400 beds in Dilley, Texas. They doubled the size of an existing detention center in Karn City, which is about an hour and a half away. And then they converted a residential facility in Berks County, Pennsylvania to detain only asylum-seeking families. And it's important to know that these prisons were opened following the award of no-bid contracts to private corporations. Corrections Corporation of America, now rebranded as Core Civic, GEO, and LaSalle Corporation. I decided to go to Texas in 2017 and 2018 to volunteer at both of those facilities after I attended a conference in Washington at the University of District of Columbia, where one of the attorneys who was regularly visiting families in those detention facilities described a 5-year-old girl who had been spitting up blood for 5 days. And the treatment was water and aspirin. And at the 5th day, they finally relented and took her to an ER for treatment. So that was under the Obama administration. Under the Trump administration, the detention of immigrant families has intensified. And we all know about the most controversial operation that directly affected these mothers seeking, and fathers too, but families seeking protection when former Attorney General Jeff Sessions instituted a zero tolerance policy of 2018. Now, as you know, it mandated the systematic criminal prosecution of all people who are entering the US without authorization, including asylum seekers. And it had the collateral effect of forcing the separation of thousands of families when the parents were transferred to federal jails, and their children, even infants and toddlers, were held alone in Border Patrol stations in cages before their transfer to juvenile detention facilities that are operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's still unclear exactly how many children were separated. We think approximately 4,500 children were separated from their families in a policy that has been described as torture by physicians in this country. But the cruelty of this policy was compounded by the administration's failure to keep accurate counts of the separation or to track the whereabouts and identities of the separated children's parents and guardians. And some of them have never been reunified. So the public uproar surrounding zero tolerance instituted by that former Attorney General forced the Trump administration to end those formal separations of families in 2018. But it's important to remember that undocumented families from the global South fleeing violence and opportunity and seeking protection have been and continue to be separated from their children. Currently, the Trump administration has targeted anyone who is present in the US without legal status and has implemented an even more aggressive campaign of detention and deportation. The Obama administration was selective about who they deported. They largely only targeted immigrants who had been charged or convicted of criminal penalties. That has changed. So when undocumented parents who are living in the US now are swept up in immigration raids and deported, their children may be forced to follow them to countries they left as children, or remain in the US with their friends, distant family, or in the most extreme cases, placed in foster care after a judge terminates the parental rights of their deported parents, excuse me. And if you want to know how this policy plays out, you should watch the Netflix documentary Immigration Nation, because you see very clearly how it happens. Many of these families now are targeted because of removal orders that were issued years, even decades before, or are picked up after the infamous misdemeanor violations like the broken tail light, driving without a license, etc. They and other members of their family, people ICE describes as collaterals, are arrested near their homes, outside of schools, at their workplaces. And the most alarming thing is required check-ins at federal buildings. That has always been a practice, but increasingly when people are showing up for those scheduled check-ins, they're taken into detention. They are not allowed to see their family. They lose communication, no goodbyes. The other thing that's happening for DACA recipients at scheduled check-ins with USCIS, which is a different federal agency than ICE, same thing can be, not always, but can happen. And under the guise of the Remain in Mexico policy, which was originally called the Migration Protection Protocols, the administration is continuing to separate and detain children while sending their parents to Mexico, and justifying this policy on the basis of so-called parental unfitness. And the detailed reports by the Women's Refugee Commission and the Texas Civil Rights Project have shown how border officials are the ones who make the determination. They have no background in child welfare. They customarily do not consult child welfare experts and are sending parents back, separating children, often without any actual evidence that parents are neglectful or abusive. And as a result, as of December 2019, 1,100 additional separations have taken place. Now, talking about the same population that Ligia mentioned in her presentation, and thanks to Ligia, I had the opportunity to interview 15 undocumented immigrant mothers who were living in Fairfax County. And they had, for the most part, migrated to escape domestic violence and left their children with relatives, not all, but some of their children with relatives in the home country, but all of them had the hope of bringing their children to this country. But they face huge obstacles in reuniting them. The heavily militarized southern border, the high cost of living in Fairfax County or in anywhere in the greater DC area, very stiff criminal penalties for legal entry or re-entry are the reasons that family separations last for years. Now, those women were very fortunate to have access to a program like the parenting classes and reunification classes. And compared to what is available here in Georgia, this is where I now live in Savannah, Georgia, they have in Fairfax County and some other jurisdictions very impressive support, enrolling their kids in public school, applying for social services, finding pro bono attorneys, and in managing all of the challenges that Ligia mentioned in parenting kids with whom they have not lived in many cases for years. But that approach, the approaches in Fairfax County and Montgomery County, Maryland, where I lived for 25 years, they took a very progressive, until recently, they took a very progressive approach to the presence of undocumented populations in their midst. They did not, by and large, enter into 287G agreements, which involves a voluntary program of detaining immigrants who are arrested by local law enforcement and then transferring them to ICE. They had not done that, but that is changing as the 287G agreements are rapidly expanding under the Trump administration. But I want to, in the time that I have left, I want to focus on the work that I've been doing here since I moved to Georgia in adult immigration prisons in this state. And since moving to Savannah 2 years ago, I have served as a volunteer. They don't have the same kinds of programs that Dilley and Karn City have, where you are a legal assistant, you are trained to help prepare mothers who are going to take a credible fear interview with an asylum officer. That doesn't exist here. What we have are voluntary visitations with people who are detained in immigration prisons. And I think it's really important to talk about this because we've all seen those horrific pictures of the kids who were separated, who were sobbing to be reunited with their parents, but we know much less about the experience of parents who are detained for long periods, waiting for their asylum claims to be adjudicated, or arrested and deported in many cases after decades of residence in this country. So I want to talk about two of the prisons that I know because I've seen it from the inside. So when you are apprehended by ICE, you will be detained in prison-like conditions indefinitely. There is no set endpoint to a detention period in an immigration prison. While you wait for a hearing on your case, you will have no right to a paid public defender, even if you are poor, and most of the families, but certainly not all, are poor. You will enter a system where there is little oversight, no meaningful grievance procedures, and serious human rights abuses of detainees. You will see a system where basic health care is virtually non-existent, the water is barely potable, and the food is so bad that you must buy your own at inflated commissary prices to stave off hunger. And this is a system where visitations with your family and friends are limited to 1 hour a week, and you are invited to volunteer to work and earn $1 a day. Now, before the spread of COVID, when everything shut down, I did these visitations in two facilities, in the Stewart Detention Facility in Lumpkin, Georgia. And this tells the story of the placement of immigration prisons, the rationale behind their location in very remote rural areas. So Stewart was built as a minimum security prison for criminal offenders in 2006, and it was empty until the federal government contracted with a for-profit company, Core Civic, to detain 1,900 men without legal status. And it's important to know that the ICE detainees are imprisoned because they're in the US without authorization, not because they have been charged with or convicted of any crimes. Any non-citizen now can be detained, including asylum seekers, survivors of torture and human trafficking, parents and children. There are no children in the immigration prisons in Georgia. Long-term residents of the US picked up after, as I said, those minor violations. Immigrants who cross the border without inspection or cross between ports of entry. Locking up undocumented immigrants has become one of the fastest growing and most profitable forms of mass incarceration in the country. As of April 2020, there were 184 ICE facilities, and 81% of these facilities are run by for-profit prison companies. Immigration detention has grown 900% since 1990. From less than 5,000 beds on any given day, there are now 50,000 beds. ICE was only created in 2001, but it has grown exponentially. And it's important to remember that, incarceration in a private prison is not a public service, it's a big business. Local municipalities welcome these prisons because they get a cut of the per diem cost that's paid by the federal government for each detainee. And Lumpkin, for example, as the other detention facility I'll describe in a second, Irwin, they're located in the poorest areas of Georgia. Stewart Detention Facility is the largest employer in the area and provides the single largest revenue stream. The local population is 62% African American, 37% white, and less than 2% Hispanic. The median household income is only $25,000, and the poverty rate is almost 38%. As I said, Stewart is managed by the largest prison company in the nation, Core Civic, which owns 43 correctional facilities with a 73,000 bed capacity. And its revenue last year was $2 billion. And I think this is interesting. It spent $1.4 million on lobbying members of Congress and $1.1 million on political contributions. Irwin Detention Facility is also in a tiny rural town 3 hours from Savannah. It's a much smaller facility that houses both men and women. Now, the irony is that because immigration detention is ostensibly a civil, not a penal system, as I said earlier, detained people have very few due process rights compared to those who are in criminal proceedings in this country. They don't have any right to government-funded representation. They do not have a right to a speedy trial. There is no ban on cruel and unusual punishment. There is no formal monitoring of prison conditions by outside inspectors. And although it is designed to be, quote, and this is from a quote from an ICE promotional brochure, it's designed to be non-punitive and merely preventative. The conditions are worse than in many state and federal prisons. And the dismal record of abuses in Stewart and Irwin there are 4 immigration prisons in Georgia, include racist taunts, physical assaults, the denial of, as I said, basic medical care, and the infliction of solitary confinement up to 23 hours a day for protesting maltreatment or even for organizing or trying to organize hunger strikes. Irwin Detention Center made the national news this week due to a whistleblower complaint. The whistleblower was a licensed practical nurse, Dawn Wooten, who alleges that detained women have been pressured into having gynecological procedures that are invasive, including hysterectomies, without knowledge or consent. They are taken in shackles to off-site appointments, and they are forced or pressured into having surgeries. Many of them, when they were interviewed recently by a congressional, in fact, on Friday, there was a congressional delegation, asked some of the women what they understood about what had happened to them, and many didn't know. They didn't know why they were taken there. They didn't know why they had medical procedures or shots. So there is an incredible lack of transparency about not only where people are located, but what happens to them, what their records are.
Probably the best would be to move to Anna Clark, who's our next presenter. And then when Dr. Terrio comes back, she can address questions. So Anna, I would ask you to start presenting, please.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Anna. I work at Casa San Jose. So I am going to really build off of what both Ligia and Dr. Terrio said earlier. It was really interesting to see how their work, kind of in a more macro educational research sense, is what we see every day at Casa San Jose. As Ligia mentioned, most of our clients right now are coming from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But I'll back up a little bit. I wanted to start with talking a little about Casa San Jose and the work that we've been doing for many years here in Pittsburgh. So we were founded by Sister Janice. She is a sister of St. Joseph, and so she has worked with the Latino community here in Pittsburgh for many, many years. She really worked to establish a sense of trust and community among the immigrants here. And so when she founded Casa San Jose in 2013 as a nonprofit, she had done so much work that Casa San Jose was and still is very respected in the Latino community here. So we at Casa San Jose provide direct services, and we also do a lot of advocacy for immigrants. So for direct services and advocacy, they're both really important to have both a micro kind of one-on-one work with the community, but as well as try to influence some of the policies and the injustices that Ligia and Dr. Terrio have mentioned already in their presentations. So like I said, we're seeing a lot of immigrants from Guatemala and Honduras, as well as El Salvador. I think previously the trends were more immigrants from Mexico and other areas, but currently those Central American countries have been kind of the highest countries represented in immigrants, Latino immigrants. So in Pittsburgh, we've seen a lot of people settling in the Beachview neighborhood. There's a large Latino community in that area. That's where Casa San Jose is located. And so that's kind of where the services are settled. It's really well located along the train in Pittsburgh. So it's a primary mode of transportation, as a lot of people can get directly to downtown from the Beachview area. We've also seen a lot of people settling into the East End. So as the community grows here, as we get more immigrants coming, they have expanded over to the East End. There's a lot of additional services and resources in that area. But we're also starting to see a lot of people moving into the outside counties. Maybe not a lot, but there's definitely enough to where Casa San Jose has started a few satellite offices. We have a new office out in Ambridge. We have people working up in Cranberry, down in Washington County, So we've really started to see a need in some of the other areas and have expanded our services to address those needs. So when families come to Pittsburgh, we often help them with a lot of different resources. I like to say when people ask what kind of resources do we help refer people to, if someone comes to CASA with a question, we'll find them an answer. Whether or not we do it ourselves, we'll help to connect them to someone who can help with that service. So a lot of that revolves around housing, employment, enrolling kids in school, food access, so finding food pantries or even the local grocery stores. Healthcare is really important. We connect people with the federally qualified health centers and other Spanish-speaking providers in the area, as well as legal resources. So we connect people to different immigration attorneys, pro bono, and family, different kinds of legal resources depending on the need. Some of the challenges that they face, I think the primary barrier that we see day to day is related to language. So people not providing interpretation at doctor's appointments or with school enrollment, they don't provide any of the forms in Spanish. And so the families cannot access those services very easily. So at Casa San Jose, we've done a lot of work, one, to help with that process in general, because it's sometimes a very complicated system that they're trying to work with, but also to advocate around that language barrier and try to help those institutions learn how to provide interpretation and learn why it's important so that the Latino community, the immigrant community, can access those resources. Another challenge that we see frequently is difficulty finding employment. When people arrive, they often don't have work permits, and so there are limited jobs in the fields that Ligia mentioned earlier of kind of construction, landscaping, restaurants. Those jobs can be hard to find sometimes. Another barrier I like to mention is childcare, because if you cannot find someone to take care of your child, you can't find employment because you can't leave the child home alone. That's also expensive, which can be really hard for the families to find affordable childcare. And if they're looking at a normal daycare, which you can find all over the city, they often don't provide interpretation. So that's another barrier. I also wanted to mention transportation as a barrier, because even though in Beachview, where the train does run, in the East End, where there are many buses, it's still complicated for immigrants to access those services, the transportation. If you don't speak English, it can be hard to know how to use the bus or how to learn how to find where you're going. It's a completely new city, you don't speak the language, so that's really complicated. But this is another piece where the advocacy really comes in that Casa San Jose does. Currently, we have a campaign called Driving PA Forward. And so our organizer, Laura Perkins, has been working really hard to advocate for immigrants getting driver's licenses. So that's an example of the direct service that we do. We do bus training. We try to help people learn how to use the bus. But we're also trying to advocate for immigrants to have more independence and to be empowered to have more access to making their needs known and being able to do what they need to do for their families. So we've also had the opportunity to work with some family reunification. Ligia did a training for us at Casa San Jose to help us understand that reunification process. As we get to know these families, they start to open up and they trust us and share some of the stories of what they've been through in their home countries and on the immigration journey and coming to Pittsburgh. The whole story has a lot of trauma, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety. So these families start to trust us and open up. So I had the opportunity to start one of the reunification classes here in Pittsburgh. It was cut short due to COVID, unfortunately, and we hope to restart it soon. But we were able to see we had a group of women, so they were able to share their stories. It became a kind of support group for each other where they had shared experiences and were able to talk to one another, encourage one another, talk about their children and kind of the similar experiences they were going through, and learn how to address that and communicate better and support one another through that. So I think the reunification piece we see a lot, the kids not understanding the parents' reasons and motivations for coming here, and the parents not understanding what the children are necessarily going through. So we've had the opportunity to see some of those barriers and also work with the families through that. I wanted to talk a little bit about COVID and how it's impacted our work at Casa and the families, because, you know, it's affected everyone across the world, truly. And here in Pittsburgh, the immigrant families and community is no different. So back in March and April, when COVID first hit, on March 15th or so, our families lost their jobs overnight, as so many people did across the country. And so the next day, they were worried about how they're going to pay their bills, how they're going to pay their rent, how to buy food. Like I said, everyone across the country is facing these same challenges. But here at Casa, in the first 2 months, we had over 250 requests for rental assistance. Now, we weren't providing that assistance, but we were helping people connect to programs that were. And so we made, since then, this first 2 months, we saw the most amount of calls for that. But since then, we've made over 300, probably 400 or more at this point, referrals for different programs that are working with rental assistance. All of the stress from COVID has had a huge impact on the family and mental health and trying to support one another. And we've really seen a lot of challenges come from COVID in this community. Casa has worked to address that. Again, back to the direct services, we're helping with the rental assistance, but we've also done a lot of advocacy. One thing that we were able to do was help over 400 families with $700 to help them meet their needs. And we did a lot of fundraising with grant writing and individual donors to help support those families in this time. One of the reasons behind that was because many of the people in the US received a stimulus check from the government. So immigrant families who filed taxes using their I-10 or their tax ID number were not eligible for that stimulus check. There was no option for them to receive it, even though they've been paying taxes and working. And additionally, even if it was a US citizen who was married to someone who had an I-10 number and they filed jointly, that family wouldn't receive that stimulus money. So Casa San Jose did a lot of work to be able to provide families here in Pittsburgh and the surrounding area, to the region, to have a little extra support during this time of COVID. But I wanted to end with the strengths, because throughout all of COVID, throughout the whole reunification process, the immigration journey, and kind of what you've seen in their home countries and why they're coming, like Ligia mentioned with the values, it really shows in the strengths that we see in their community. They're very family and community oriented, they're resourceful, they're motivated, they're hardworking, dedicated. And one thing that I've noticed recently with COVID is that, like all families learning to do virtual education, we have helped a lot of people learn how to use technology, access internet, and have just seen a lot of flexibility throughout all of this. So that's a little bit about what Casa is doing here in the community. Like I said, it's really what Ligia and Dr. Terrio said is what we're seeing here. Those trends that they mentioned are exactly seen here in Pittsburgh. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you very much, Ana. Muchas gracias. Dr. Terrio disappeared before, and I learned that's because there was a storm. But we have her here back. We would like you to finish the presentation that was in the interesting part, too.
You know, I realize we're probably running a little bit short of time, but what I wanted to point out was that the immigration courts are positioned within the Stewart Detention Center. And so all of the cases are heard by immigration judges in Atlanta, and that's unfortunate because they only grant 2 to 3% of asylum cases that are heard by immigration judges there. And the stories are heartbreaking. That's what we did as volunteers, is just talk to the people who were detained, and they all have horrific travel stories, overcoming adversity, getting to the US. And one gentleman from West Africa, I speak French fluently, that I interviewed, had left, you know, he'd been beaten severely, almost to death in his home country of Ghana, got into Brazil, worked his way up the entire continent, crossed the US border, passed a credible fear interview, and then was shuttled among Customs and Border Protection facilities in shackles for 3 weeks before he was sent to Stewart. And because he had all of his documents and all of his medical records and affidavits, he was sure that he would get asylum, and he didn't. He was denied. And when I spoke with him, he had been languishing in detention for a solid year because his case was denied, and he was insistent that he would try to appeal it. But the other thing that I just wanted to mention very briefly are the legal changes that have been introduced in US immigration law by the Trump administration, specifically that affect these mothers who are fleeing domestic violence or violence from criminal groups outside the home. There were two opinions known as the matter of AB and matter of LEA that now have the force of national precedent, and they directly impact these mothers and children who suffer forms of violence from non-state actors, such as domestic abusers, gangs, and criminal groups. And that had been something that allowed them to present an asylum case and to have their abuse recognized as persecution. That is no longer possible. So I just want to emphasize that we are making war on a population of very vulnerable people who are routinely denied their constitutional right to humane treatment and due process while in detention. And now that the pandemic has been used by the administration to completely seal the border, the administration hardliners have achieved with COVID what they were unable to do or only able to do piecemeal, which is effectively blocking anyone with an asylum claim or petition from getting into the country. And just, what I think we should be doing, obviously we have to have a certain measure of security, but we should be monitoring asylum seekers and other people who are fleeing different forms of violence through non-custodial forms of supervision, not detain them. We should allow them to wait in safety in the US for the resolution of their cases. I mean, the other issue is that the immigration courts have been weaponized by this administration, and there are enormous case backlogs. So if you have to remain detained until your case is heard, you could be in detention for years. We need to reverse these current bars on asylum for people who flee domestic or gang violence and enable law-abiding residents who came here as children to qualify for legal status. We need a return to a rule of law in this country and to justice in immigration policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terrio. So now that we have heard our three panelists speak, it would be really nice if we could ask a few questions. I wanted to ask all of you, you mentioned some things we need to do and that we need to change, but those are national things. What can we do? And this is for the three panelists. What can we do us here? Activism, what kind of concrete steps can we take to help this situation? And whoever wants to take the question first can.
I can take a stab at it. One of the things, based on what Anna was just talking about, people who, undocumented family members who lost jobs and were immediately vulnerable to being evicted and not having enough food on the table. There was a rally in Savannah yesterday, and the Southern Undocumented Student Alliance, one of the things they're doing is a very local level initiative, is getting a GoFundMe campaign to come up with money to be dispersed to the immigrant families who really can't put food on the table. And there's another, there are so many things like that that could be done. Writing your Congress people, there were 100 people at the rally, which is, it's a nice gesture, but we need to raise awareness. We need to contact, our local elected officials and, state and national officials as well. But there's another way. People who are in immigration prison, as I've said, don't have the money. I mean, the food that we heard about from detainees was full of worms, it was spoiled, it was virtually inedible. So there's a way that you can contribute to their commissary accounts. You can do it, you can set up you know, a way to put money on their accounts every month. So, or you can send them books. You can, when things are fairly normal again, you can go visit and listen to them. And you know, one of the themes throughout all of these presentations is stories, giving people the power to use their own voices, to tell their own stories in whatever way possible. And I think that, you know, using art in, you know, defined very broadly, visual art, poetry, music, is a very cathartic and therapeutic way for people who have experienced traumatic crossings and then suffer the trauma of being detained and separated from their children, even if they think that ultimately at one point they can be released. Those stories, you know, empower people to take control, to a measure of control over their lives and to be heard outside, you know, their communities or by their communities. So I think there are so many things that we can do on the local level. Those are just a couple of suggestions.
Thank you. Those are great ideas. Anna, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so I would just add to that, like here in Pittsburgh, there's a lot of local advocacy groups who do a lot of work with immigration and really across the state in Pennsylvania. So I would recommend looking into some of those groups if you're interested in getting more involved. I know there's the Pittsburgh Immigrant Coalition, or it's PIC. There's a couple of different ones who are really active. So looking into those to kind of reach out to your legislator and see what's happening across the state. Casa, like I said, does a lot of work with this, so you can look on our website or our Facebook page and see what we're doing and find ways to get involved through that. Of course, financial donations are always good for the community members so that I love that idea of the GoFundMe and trying to raise support for those families on a local level. I think that's really great.
Thank you. Those are wonderful ideas. The Pittsburgh Interfaith Impact Network is another group that works on these kind of causes. Ligia, would you like to add something?
Yes, I would like to say that when I came here, my intention was to bring the family reunification program to the school system here, Pittsburgh Public Schools. And it was hard. There's nothing close to that. There are no parent liaisons in the schools, for example, which help a lot in outreach, for the immigrant population, and not only Spanish speaking families. I'm talking about reaching out to all families. So in Fairfax, we had parent liaisons in different languages and from different heritage and cultural background in different schools. So if the school was primarily or the minority was African American, then they try to hire a parent liaison that would be from African American heritage, so the community could feel represented, you know, by the parent liaison or community liaison. And the same for Hispanic in areas where the Hispanic population was larger. And I am still willing to train people. I would love to train people, especially the school system. I think it's necessary, even if it's only, what is it, 0.2? What did you say, Patricia, is our Hispanic population? Or, but it's not
2.2%, 2.2.
2.2% the Hispanic population in Pittsburgh, but this program is not only for Hispanics because it can be adapted to work with immigrants from other regions, because there are immigrants, as Susan was giving that example of that man from Africa, right, Susan?
Uh-huh.
And a French-speaking African country, you know, there are families who are migrating and leaving their families and their kids behind, and they need to prepare. So the program can help parents prepare prior to that reunification. It's actually better if they start thinking about these issues prior to bringing their children or to reuniting with their children. And even if the separation is going to be temporary, it does help to go through these kind of classes and think about these issues that they might encounter once they want to live again with their children. Now I have a full-time job, but I will still do it. And I would love to help. You know, Casa was the one that was ready, and we're gonna start thinking about ideas to bring the family reunification program through Zoom. Anna and I were talking already about it.
Great.
Yeah, so that they don't miss that. You know, we don't wait too long until they have access to these kind of things. And what a better way to do it than when it's run by a social worker like Anna, you know, who's bilingual and understand these issues. So I just wanted to say that we need more of these kind of supports in Pittsburgh as well.
I also wanted to mention that between last year and early this year, there was a glass artist that had a wonderful, wonderful exhibit in the Glass Center about migration and death in the desert. It was really powerful. So Jaime Guerrero is his name. I have another question here. It says, do you see Afro-Latinx folks receiving different treatment in immigration detention centers, disproportionately harsher timelines for court dates? And yes, probably Dr. Terrio first, and if somebody else wants to chime in.
So I'm sorry, I don't think I understood. Is it so people who are of Afro descent, was that the question?
If they are Latinos from Afro descent,
Okay.
they get treated worse and get worse timelines for court dates.
That's an excellent question. I think there are two groups who are most at risk for those racist taunts that I talked about. The general mistreatment, these nurses have been, totally ignoring written requests from detained people to get medical care. They feel sick. They think they have COVID symptoms. They've been ripping those requests up. But what we have heard is that Black people in particular, I think, regardless of where they come from, and most especially Indigenous people, Indigenous Central Americans who are there's in fact a really good book that was just published on the particular vulnerability of Indigenous women who are incarcerated in immigration prisons. So I think it probably would depend on the area and the particular makeup of the personnel who work in the prisons. In Georgia, there's a huge problem with, tiny Latinx or Hispanic communities locally. So there's no workforce to draw on. There are very few people who are fluent in any language other than English. So that, cultural differences, complaints, things that are grounded in, food preferences and different hygiene standards are the basis for, serious misunderstandings that devolve into, really racist comments and treatment. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to get to another question that we have here. And it says, Professor Terrio, why do international organizations that protect human rights did not act firmly to protect children's health and safety affected by U.S. immigration laws?
Oh, that's a huge question. That's a huge question.
Well, we have a few minutes.
So why don't so the question was, why don't international NGOs who are looking at conditions in the U.S. Put more emphasis on mental health and overall basic health?
In protecting the children, like Amnesty International, why don't they do anything?
Well, I think there have been international NGOs like the national UNHCR, the Commissioner of High Refugees. I think they have produced some very important studies. They've conducted interviews with children who have been detained at the border. Children, they haven't been able to conduct any interviews inside the closed facilities that are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But they have, opened a window onto the challenges that kids face. The problem is the federal system. It's a system that is closed. They do, in the ORR, that is the Office of Refugee Resettlement Facilities, they have, in theory, very strict regulations about the delivery of medical and mental health. They have access to counseling once a week. Those facilities compared to the adult immigration prisons are much, much better. But the issues go back to trauma and the fact that they are, the irony is that some of the kids who have the most compelling cases for getting legal status are the ones who spend much longer periods of time in custody and are therefore, they're traumatized because what they have experienced on the way. They're frustrated and feel, sort of penned up because they are in these closed facilities. And the other thing that has made the whole situation more difficult, I talked about adult immigration detention, but the people who have been running the Office of Refugee Resettlement under the Trump administration, by and large, the directors have no experience in managing refugee populations. And the emphasis coming down from the top has been on security and risk. So they haven't been amenable to expanding, medical and mental health programs. It's a huge problem.
Okay, thank you. And I have a comment from Dr. Chavez-Geneco, and perhaps our other two panelists could comment on the comment. It says, while the Latino population of Allegheny County or the city of Pittsburgh might be only 2.2%, the representation of the Latino population in the school districts and in general in the 18 years and younger segment is much higher. And the Latino population is younger. And I will add, yes, 30% of the Latinos in Allegheny County are under 18, which is huge compared to the rest. Do you have anything to say about this? Any comment in your experience, Anna or Ligia?
No, I would just say that, we do see a lot of children. We have a youth program at Casa, so we are, working to help some of that community as well, that population.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is another comment from Hector. Are there successful examples of fighting against the privatization of detention centers in the US that could benefit all in the incarcerated population, including the immigrant and refugees? I have a piece of an answer to that, not really an answer, but at Casa San Jose, where I'm the president of the board, when we had to put some of our money aside, we checked that the accounts had no, where we were investing, had no for-profit prisons.
I think I would just say really quickly, what the recent events at Irwin have, there has been a groundswell of opposition since the zero tolerance policy in 2018 close these facilities, to stop detaining children, to stop separating parents and children. And I think that there is a groundswell of people who are horrified that we are running facilities that are manifestly cruel. And so I think one thing we can put our emphasis on is, joining movements to close them down. And Congress makes immigration policy because of the plenary powers doctrine. Congress is where we need to, send our complaints.
Thank you very much. We are at the time, really. So I would like to thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists, Ligia Diaz, Anna Clark, and Dr. Terrio, who came back after the storm. Also Manuel for introducing us. And thank you all the audience for making great questions and being interested in these topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.